Parshas Vayeshev. Parshas Vayeshev begins the descent of the Jewish people into their exile, and what is interesting to note is that because the vast majority of Jewish history is the experience of the diaspora Jew, we find a tremendous amount of insight by the commentators who are able to look into the Yosef story and see a reflection upon the perennial diaspora experience. Right? The going down to exile is the perpetual story of the diaspora Jew, and we find inspiration and lessons, therefore, from this particular passage. And I wanted to highlight two different commentaries on Vayeshev, which are addressing two completely different junctures in the Parsha, but converge on the same idea. One is the Piazetzna, the Eish Kodesh, who was killed al Kiddush Hashem during the Shoah. And he writes on the pasuk of Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz migurei aviv be'eretz Canaan, that Yaakov dwelled in the land of his father's dwelling, in the land of Canaan. So we know the famous medrash that is quoted by Rashi. Bikesh Yaakov leishev bishalva. In source number 2, Yaakov sought to live in tranquility. Kafatz alav rugzo shel Yosef, and that's when the wrath or the turmoil or the turbulence of Yosef jumped upon him. Tzadikim avakshim leishev bishalva. The righteous seek to live in tranquility. Omer HaKadosh Baruch Hu lo dayan latzadikim mashem asukanam laolam haba. God says it's not enough for the righteous, that which is prepared for them in the world to come. Elashim avakshim leishev bishalva ba'olam hazeh. But they even seek to live in tranquility in this world. God says, no, that shall not transpire. It shall not be that the righteous shall live lives of tranquility and peacefulness in this world. Now, of course, this is theologically disturbing because we do find that righteous do get their rewards in this world. So how do we reconcile that? That's not a discussion for now. But one of the things that I wanted to try and discover is how would someone who's living through the Shoah approach this chazal? And how would he find comfort from it? That God says the righteous don't deserve to have tranquility in this world because your portion is waiting for you in the world to come. So you're living in the ghetto, in the Warsaw ghetto, and you're reading those words in your Mavir Sedra and you're reading Rashi. What kind of view does that, or what kind of message does that Rashi provide for you? So we're coming into the middle of the Piazetzna in his commentary to Parshas Vayeshev, and he writes as follows. He's actually talking about a zemer that we sing, Kol Mekadei Shavi, which many of you know. And there's a line in there that people are rest on Shabbos b'charishu v'katzir le'olamim, both in the times of harvest and the times of plowing and the times of harvest. It's the time of Shabbos, is a time of rest. He says as follows, Aval od efshar lomar al osan hatzadikim. We can say about those righteous shekol kach olim b'Shabbos kodesh, that have such an elevation on Shabbos, ad she'en yecholim ledaber es ma shemasigim u'margishim. Sometimes a tzaddik has such a spiritual elevation on Shabbos kodesh that he can't even articulate into words what he's experiencing. Azor lashovsim bashvi'i becharish. That's the way he learns the pasuk in the Zemer, which says, God aid those people who are chorshim, or Azor lashovsim, those who rest on Shabbos, help them during the times of charish. And what does the word charish means? Not just plowing, but becharish means cheresh. What does a cheresh mean?
Deaf.
A person who is mute, a deaf mute, cannot speak. Migodel hahasaga, sometimes a person is muted because he has such a lofty spiritual experience that he cannot even articulate it into words. He says, Kizeh hachiluk bein charisha uvein almut. He says there are two words to describe a mute. One in Hebrew, one is cheresh and one is ilaim. Ilaim is a mute and cheresh is a mute also. They're used interchangeably. Sometimes Sometimes there are halachic definitions because a cheresh is usually a deaf mute and an ilaim is a mute. But he says that both of them refer to an inability to speak. But he says the distinction is as follows. Charisha al pirov omrim kishiyesh ledaber harbe umikol makom eino medaber. We say about a person who's a cheresh that he has a lot to say, but he doesn't speak. Kegon im hacheresh tacharishi ba'es hazos, like Mordechai said to Esther. If you are a cheresh at this moment, if you refuse to speak, and there's plenty for you to say to Achashverosh, but if you fail to speak, you see the word cheresh means when there's something to say and you don't say it, you're called a cheresh. Ve'atem tacharishun chedome, or when Moshe Rabbeinu said to the Jewish people, Hashem yilachem lachem ve'atem tacharishun, God will fight for you when it comes to going out of Egypt, and you shall be silent, means you'll have what to say, but you won't need to say anything. Shebekulam hayalahem ledaber rak hecherishu. Ma she'en kein kishe'ish ha'Yisraeli chas v'sholom kol kach nishbar v'ratzutz ad she'en lo ma ledaber. But there's another kind of silence. There's a cheresh silence when I have so much to say, but because I'm experiencing such a spiritual high, I can't articulate it into words. That's a cheresh experience. There's an ilaim experience, which describes a person who's so wretched and so broken because of his suffering that he has nothing to say. That's an ilaim. Lo masig v'lo margish, he can't perceive things, he can't feel anything, he's beyond feeling sensation. Af ein lo moach v'lo lev, he has no brain, he has no heart anymore. Bamela hasik, that he has no faculties for perception or for perceiving or for thinking anymore. Uvamala hargish, az ein zot charisha rak almut, ki ilaim she'en lo hadibur. That's what you call an ilaim. He has nothing he can say because he can't feel anything anymore. Then he says as follows: Aval yesh shekishiish Yisraeli ro'eh shechas v'shalom muchrecha eit tzara la'avor bekatnus nefila ushavira. There are some times when a Jew realizes that this is a time of great persecution. Az mischazek umat'im et atzmo le'eit tzara ad ya'avor za'am. And he strengthens himself and he says, I've got to weather the storm. I've got to be strong. Va'omer la'atzmo hein ilaim ani ata. He says, I know that I don't have words that I can really articulate that well. Aval gam ha'ilaim medaber ma'at lefi almuto berimiza. But even then, because he knows he's got to be strong, he can mumble a couple of words. He can motion his expressions to some degree. The gamani ma'at adaber ermos ba'almuti, and therefore, I know it's a tough time. I know I'm suffering, but I have to say something. I'll say a couple of words. Aval kishechas v'shalom mosifim hatzarot al Yisrael lehitchazek v'kol echad yoter nishbar v'ratzutz. He says, but then when the persecution becomes even greater, and every person is broken and shattered into pieces, azhu b'chinat v'hinei anachnu me'alamim alumim b'toch hasadeh. He says that's Yosef's dream. Because what is the word for sheaves of wheat in the story, in the dream of Yosef? When the sheaves are bowing down to Yosef in the field, alumot, right? Alumot are the sheaves, which comes from the word elaine. So what the dream is representing is a time of great suffering for the Jewish people because of the enslavement, because of the galus that Yosef is dreaming about. And we're out in the field. Sadeh nodahi habechina shekol avodat Yisrael magia la umetakna bechinas kereach hasadeh shepirish rashi chakal tapuchim umechatzadeh chakla. So he goes into the Kabbalistic explanation of what the field is. The field is the place where a Jew realizes his potential and has to elevate spiritually. Ma'alumim alumim b'toch hasadeh. So what Yosef is saying is that even though we're mute, but we're still in the midst of the field, batorah va'avoda habechina ilaim odnit alma yoter. So even though we're trying to engage in our Torah, and even though we're trying to serve Hashem with the mitzvahs amidst our suffering and amidst our persecution, but we're ma'alamim alumim. which means a double form of Elam, a double form of Almut. We're totally mute now. Ad shegam ki Elam I efshar ledaber, so that I can't even get out even of those few insignificant words or motions that a normal Elam should be able to say. I'm totally, totally mute. I'm totally, totally silenced. Az v'hinei kama alumati v'gam nitzava. But that's when Yosef says in my dream, my sheaf of wheat, which represents my muteness, is kama. It gets up. It gets up, and it stands up, and despite the muteness of the experience, despite the great shattered nature that I feel, I have to get up. Mikodem kvar ratziti lahatot shichmi v'lichyot chayei almut. He says, because the tzaddik in his dream, what Joseph is trying to convey is that I wanted to just lie down and be silent and live a life of silence and let me just live in my suffering and unload myself. Just let me indulge in my own personal grief and my own personal suffering. Aval keshem almim alumim, but when everyone around me is in the same grief-stricken silence, as lo yacholti kavar lispol et ha'almut, I can't just wallow in my own silence. V'nit chazakti litzok yoter el Hashem. So that's why I had to get up, and I had to cry out to God even more, even though I have no words to say. Va'az v'hinei tesubena alumotechem. And then that's the next part of Yosef's dream, that your sheaves of wheat all gathered around in response to my cries. Shegamatem nitchazaktem al yadi. That you were strengthened because I was able to somehow, in some miraculous way, muster a cry, even though I'm wallowing in my own breakage, in my own brokenness. V'zeh tzadikim mevakshim leishev b'shalva ba'olam hazeh lahatim et atzmam lahagalut v'hatzarot. He says that's what Rashi means when he says that tzaddikim in this world want to live in shalva, in tranquility. Let me just endure my own suffering. Leave me alone. That's the type of tzara that the Piazetzna says is what we're experiencing in the Shoah, right, is that the tzaddikim want to live in tranquility. Doesn't mean they want to live in peace. They want to be able to wallow in their own grief and pain. Leave me alone. Stop coming to me. I'm not your Rebbe anymore. There's no Rebbes, there's no shuls, there's no Torah, there's nothing. There's nothing. We're all just broken vessels. And he says, so Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so Hashem says in response, Lo dayan lahatzadikim mashemesukan lahem la'asid lavo. He says, God says, no, a true tzaddik can't just wait for the end to come and wait for Olam Haba. Be'emes lo dayan mash la'asid yatov, rakamata ya'oru rachamim sheme'ata yoshia Hashem es Yisrael. They can't just look forward to a time when the pain will be over in death. They have to cry out to Hashem now, despite their own personal pain. So you just imagine the Piazetzna writing this in his own personal suffering, and he says, if it were just for me, I would just roll over and wait to die. But I can't, because people are depending upon me, and I have to therefore go on. What a powerful idea. And here he's discovering his own personal experience of Galus in the story of Yaakov Avinu. And then to take that to another part of our parsha, which is what I wanted, which is side B, which is Reb Shlomo Kluger of, if I'm not mistaken, the 19th century, the Maharshal. And he quotes, he has a sefer on Chanukah called the Kehilas Yaakov. And he talks about, there's a medrash which connects the story of the Duda'e Reuven, which we read about in Parshas Vayetze, the mandrakes of Reuven that he gathered for his mother Leah, and the story of Chanukah. There's a medrash, it's an obscure medrash, it's not even clear what the source of the medrash is, but it's quoted in a number of svarim. So let's take a look how he understands it. Bamidrash, Hadudaim natnu reach, the mandrakes are giving forth their fragrance. Zer Reuven shehitzilis Yosef. This refers to Reuven. Reuven is known as the man of the mandrakes, because he's the one that gathered those flowers for his mother. So when we say that the mandrakes are giving off their fragrance, it means that there was a time in Reuven's life when he really shone, when he really displayed his greatness. And that was this episode in this week's Parsha, when Reuven goes ahead and saves Yosef from being killed by his brothers and says, let's throw him in the pit. Va'al pisachenu kol migadim. And the rest of the pasuk in Shir Hashirim continues, and it says, and in our doorways are all types of pleasantries. What does that refer to? Zener Chanukah. This refers to the Hanukkah lights. So, in some very strange way, the Medrash is taking one pasuk from Shir Hashirim and is connecting the story of Reuven saving Yosef to the story of Ner Chanukah, to the light of Hanukkah. So, what is the connection between these two events? He explains that, just looking at the second line, he says, Hine yesh lomar, masha omar Reuven lahapilo habor. What Reuven had in mind when he said, let's throw Yosef in the pit, haveh hakavana ki hevin shemizeh ya'aleh. That Reuven understood that sometimes you have to go into a pit in order to ascend. In order to be able to experience success and ascent, you have to first be thrown into a pit. That when the Jewish people are thrust down into the dust, then they have a chance of success, of arising out of the ashes, arising out of the dust, and experiencing greatness. And that's what the words ve'ala min ha'aretz, that the Jewish people will be able to arise from the earth. We have to put them into the earth first, bring them down to the most broken state before they can arise to greatness. V'chein havi kavanas Reuven. That was Reuven's whole intention. Da'adarabba, im yashlichuhu habora, v'yihi yanofel ha'aretz az ya'aleh. That Reuven realized that in order for Yosef to be able to achieve his destiny of greatness, he had to be thrown into a pit first, because as we know in Judaism, especially in Hasidic thought, there's something called Yerida Litzorech Aliyah. You have to go down in order to be able to build up the velocity by going all the way down, and then you can come up and make a meteoric rise to greatness. So he says, V'chein havi, and that's exactly what happened. Ulakach ne'emar, and that's why it says, Vayimshechu vayalu et Yosef min habor. That's when it says that they pulled Yosef and elevated him out of the pit. The min habor nimshach aliyato. It was only as a result of being thrown in the pit that he could experience his aliyah. V'havi haremez hapalatola bor atzmo l'mashiach b'mitzrayim natun babor. And the whole story of Yosef being thrown in the pit is an allusion, a metaphor, for the experience of Egyptian exile, of the Jewish people as a whole being thrown into the pit of servitude. And the metaphor of Yosef being pulled up and raised up out of the pit is an allusion to the greatness that the Jewish people will experience. That they pulled Yosef out of the bore and they made him into a great person. And it also is when he was pulled out of the BAYT HaSohar, which was also called a pit. So all of the things that happened to Yosef at the hands of his brothers are an allusion to Yosef's future life and the future life of the Jewish people. That's what the Medrash means when it says that Yosef was brought down to Egypt. Shalat behom. That means that he was able to have this power of rulership as a result. Klomar keven tahayelo yerida achar yerida, because he had this constant descent after descent, uchbar hurad ad katzeh acharon, and he went down to the lowest levels, to the lowest of depths. Memela sofo lishlot bahon. That's why he was able to eventually become the ruler of Egypt. Ulefizeh muchach kavanas Reuven havi. The Amar Hayarida ad Afar Havisibas Aliyasa. That Reuven understood this. Reuven understood that bringing Yosef to the greatest depth would be the way to propel him to greatness. Now, why this phenomenon is true, okay, there could be a number of explanations why this is true, that in order for a Jew to experience greatness, he first has to experience the most abject of suffering and the depths of brokenness. Many times it's in order to be able to humble the human being, because you cannot have a great person in a state of great success and leadership if he's full of himself. And so first Yosef has to experience being utterly and totally broken, lose that sense of vanity that he has, as we know, when he's a youth. And only then can he rise to the great Yosef that he's destined to be by going through the hard knocks of life, which we see so many times in people's life's experiences, which is why for a diaspora Jew to look at this passage and to see collectively the experience of the Jewish people, you see that Rav Kluger also was saying this is a reflection upon the Jewish experience of Galus. We Jews go through Galus so that we can ascend and be pulled out of the pit at some point later in our history and take our place as the rightful leaders of the world in the Messianic age. And he continues, and he says that this is also the message of Chanukah. I'll just speak it out outside. He says that as the story goes in the Gemara, that they found a pach shemen, they found a cruse of oil in the Beis HaMikdash, but it's not just they found it, it was in a corner in the earth. He says the whole story of the miracle of Chanukah is of that very same illusion, that the Jewish people had to be thrust into the dust. We were that cruse of oil, that solitary cruse of oil that was thrown into the dirt and buried in the earth. And it was only after that we experienced that abject kind of lowliness could we be elevated through the miracle of Chanukah to take our place as the leaders of our destiny. So that very story of Reuven is also the story of Chanukah. And that is what connects the two in this medrash, because of this pasuk in Shir HaShirim, that just like Reuven understood that you need to have a Yerida L'tzorech Aliyah, you need to go down to the depths in order to be able to ascend to greatness. That's what the Jewish people experienced. And it's true, it's a reflection on all iterations of Judaism. We sometimes have to go to the greatest of depths, and the lower the depth is, the greater the ascent shall be. And so, let us hope that whether it's through the Piazetzna's experience of abject suffering, that he has to find this voice of his to be able to cry out and no longer be mute, and that's the message that he sees in the story of diaspora that is beginning for the Jewish people. Or perhaps it's an even more optimistic voice, that out of the despair and out of the brokenness comes this ascent to greatness. Hopefully, this great brokenness that the Jewish people experienced in the 20th century is propelling us to that ultimate greatness that we're going to see b'mehera b'yameinu. Okay? Have a great day.